perimeter with 1:15 left on this 5-minute major. Puck put in front, Quap the save, rebound loose, backhand,
oh my goodness,
scores, and he shot that one between his legs, did Michkov.
Hat trick. Watch this here, folks. This is unbelievable. Matvei Michkov with the incredibly quick hands. Nice puck work around by the Russians. As number 17, keep your eyes on him here. The puck pops out. It's rolling on him as it comes out here, and he is going to just put it right between his legs.
Hey everybody, it's Isaiah. Just reminding you that FlyersNittyGritty.com and the O&B Puckcast are brought to you by Summit Public Adjusters. Hey, do you have damage to your home? Not sure who to call? We suggest that you call Summit Public Adjusters before your insurance company. Dealing with your insurance company can be very stressful. Let Summit take the stress out of the claims process. From storm damage to your roof, to toilet overflows, to broken pipes and fires, Summit gets you the most money for your repairs. So next time Mother Nature leaves you in need of repairs, call Summit Public Adjusters at 215-752-0560 or visit summitpublicadjusters.com. Licensed in PA and New Jersey.
And we are back. It is Isaiah. Welcome to the O&B Puckcast, episode number 222. Is this room 222? I don't know. Do we hear the flute? No, guess not. But the Philadelphia Flyers, for people who might get that, have been around longer than room 222. We're brought to you by FlyersNittyGritty.com and also by Jim South Street. And before we get rolling, just a reminder that Jim's South Street is back. They are back at 400 South Street in Philadelphia, PA. 40 years of the best cheesesteaks, hoagies, fries, you name it, in the grandest Philadelphia tradition. You know you want one. So the next time you're down there, or if you live nearby and you can use a Uber Eats or DoorDash, what have you, check out Jim's South Street, 400 South Street in Philadelphia, PA. And with that, our panel tonight is, well, we'll be coming on board. The great Dan Silver is on assignment tonight, and our buddy Chef to the left, B, should be joining us directly. But we do have from 97.3 ESPN in South Jersey and the podcast. And I'm having a brain cramp here. Help me. You would think I would remember it. Ha ha. Kevin Durso, how are you, man?
I'm doing well. How are you?
All right. So, I mean, there's a lot to talk about with the Philadelphia Flyers, but there's also a lot that you could make up. And I think if you're on social media these days, Kevin, the biggest subject on people's minds is whether Matvei Michkov, according to all these accounts on hockey Twitter, whether he's going to be coming over from Russia early, what are the odds? And then you have all these social media posts with him. Are they little clues as to what could be happening? So if you could, based on what you are aware of, distill for us, what is the latest with Matvei? Maybe what are the odds in your mind, and where do you think things stand?
Yeah, I mean, the odds are certainly better than they seemed a few weeks ago. I'll say that much, because I don't think that we're hearing the things we're hearing, kind of, and that some of this stuff is out there, especially in the interviews that you're hearing from the Russia side of things, with Roman Rottenberg, for example. You wouldn't be hearing those things and seeing quotes like that if there was nothing to this. But, I'm not sitting here expecting anything to happen. I'm kind of probably like a lot of other people, I'm in wait and see mode. And I think that there's certainly an element of this where whatever anybody else knows on the Flyer side of this, they're not going to tell you anyway. They can't jump the gun on this. The word, I've kind of constantly kept saying that the fan base is salivating over this possibility because it would be the most touted prospect that they've had debut probably since Eric Lindros. And to have that possibility, especially forget 1 year in advance, 2 years in advance of what everybody seemed to think, would be certainly unexpected and exciting. And it would be an instant, attention grabber. It would definitely bring people to the building. And I think all of that it's not only is it valid to be excited about it, but I think that's the fans' role, is to be excited about things like this and kind of have the what if feeling right now. What we have to consider is the role of everybody else that's involved with this, that there's, certainly from my standpoint, I can't jump the gun on any of this and assume anything that's not out there already, because there's just not going to be a lot. Let's remember that this is the same prospect that nobody seemed to know the Flyers were as interested in until it became draft day. And then after the fact, it's, oh yeah, by the way, he made a visit to the facility. We shut the whole facility down so he could tour it and nobody knew that that's what was going on, kind of thing. So they've done a good job of keeping certain things around Matvei Michkov under wraps, and this would be no different in my opinion. I would fully expect that until something is signed on the dotted line, that the contract is terminated in the KHL and that there is an entry-level contract that can be signed from the Flyers end. I think you won't hear anything official or anywhere close to it until that is pretty much happened and done.
Okay. What I have heard is that there's a possibility he could be loaned to the Flyers, but the Flyers only. He wouldn't play in the AHL and ride buses and get slammed into the boards and minor league venues. That if he could make the NHL club, that it's possible he could be here.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I heard some pundits, I think it was Anthony Sanfilippo, put it at 50-50. I don't know where he's getting that, and no knock on Ant, not at all.
No, absolutely.
But it's every bit as likely that he could finish his KHL season, and then after their season is done, he could join the Flyers for a look-see, and that the Flyers could give him an entry-level deal and then load it with bonuses, like San Jose did with Will Smith. And that would be kind of funneled to the agent, because the agent is the one who's really the facilitator here, which connects to Fedotov, and maybe why he got the extra money. Maybe you could kind of lay all that out for people.
Yeah. And I think the Fedotov thing is a big part of this, because to me, the way that I understand it is that the contract, the loan possibility that you're bringing up would be kind of that end of season thing, that if he plays out a KHL season, then they loan him for kind of a trial run, then it is strictly a loan. And then he would, again, be able to probably go back and finish out the contract potentially if they wanted to go that route. That doesn't sound like it involves the buyout portion that needs to happen to terminate the deal completely. For Matvei Michkov to be a Flyer in October, though, the buyout has to happen. He has to terminate the contract. So, and it kind of goes back to the reason I bring Fedotov into this, is because it kind of goes back to the discussion of which contract was valid last season, and when the Flyers had told the contract of Fedotov, and everybody comes out and says, between the NHL, the IIHF, that's the contract that's valid, the NHL one, not the KHL one that he had just signed. And then, the KHL just kind of poo-pooed that idea and said, no, he's playing here, forget about it. And that's the way that it went from the Flyers perspective, until all of a sudden Fedotov was in the NHL after all. But in this case, I don't think there would be, for him to start the season with the Flyers, I don't think there would be any working around it any other way. The thing that I have kind of pieced together from this is that, to your point about the NHL AHL kind of flexibility here, is that if they were going to go down this path of allowing Michkov to terminate the contract and go to North America, sign with the Flyers, become part of the organization in full force, basically, that the idea is that he's not terminating the contract for an up and down, back and forth between the AHL and NHL. It is to be an NHL player effective day one and to play with the Flyers and the Flyers only. And that if for any reason they would feel like he was now no longer capable of being an NHL player this early, let's just say that they would basically loan him back to the KHL
Okay.
team because they keep his rights. And then it becomes a kind of a situation of, as long as he's not an NHLer, then the team still has his rights to be able to utilize him, even if there's not the active 2 years left on the contract and it was terminated, they would be able to like loan him back, kind of along the lines of what they did with Alexei Kolosov, that they signed the entry level deal, but they still loaned him over to the KHL last season. So think of it like that in terms of what would happen if they were able to kind of see how he does from the very beginning. But I do think that there's also, I think you can also put some percentage into this on that other possibility that he does play in the KHL, plays a full season, and then we see what happens after that, especially if the Flyers are still actively playing at the time and there's room for maybe a small trial period, and then go from there. That's kind of where I bump the odds up a little bit too, is that I feel like the odds of him coming over early are significantly greater if we're talking over the course of the next 2 years. I think it's certainly got a much, if we're already talking about this now, then I think when we get to next offseason, if something doesn't happen this season, it would be right back on the table. And it would, obviously at that point, you're talking about paying off less of a contract in the KHL because it would be 1 year further. Maybe it works out better in that situation. So I certainly think that the odds that he's over early are certainly greater. I just don't know how certain I feel about banking on him being a Flyer come day one of the 24-25 season.
Gotcha. And thanks for clearing that up. It
Absolutely.
does help. Let's take a positive spin, though. Let's assume, because we like getting people excited, and I've been accused of being a little bit of a party pooper with regard to this. I'm just more reserved. I'm getting into my 55th year of following the team, and I just let it happen. I don't need to be first. I just want to get it right. But let's just take the positive tack here, because you mentioned Kolosov. He was kind of like a little bit lost here culturally. And I don't know whether it had more to do with being in Lehigh Valley and he didn't quite have the support he would have if he were up with the big club. How do they handle this if Michkov is here? Do they have to have a Russian teammate, besides someone like Igor Zamula, who will likely be here at least for training camp? But do they need a veteran? Do they need some kind of ex-player who's Russian? Like, how do they handle this? And from the lineup perspective, does that move up their timeline? Not so much in terms of competing, but give them the more urgency to go out and get a center who could stay in the lineup, someone a little bit more reliable than Frost.
Yeah, so that's an interesting. The first part of the question is certainly an interesting one in terms of kind of how do you handle him if he comes over, and who do you kind of assign to be responsible for, not just responsible for him, I would say, but like kind of to help him get his feet wet, to help him get situated,
like a mentor,
and have the right situation. I feel like what we're likening this to is kind of the role that Danny Briere always used to have with some of the younger guys, whether it was Claude Giroux or Sean Couturier, having them live with him for a while. And we've seen that around the league too. There's been a lot of talk about in Dallas that Joe Pavelski had Wyatt Johnston live with him. And you see what kind of results that can have when you have a veteran player who's really talented, who's done a lot in the league, had success in the league, and then bring in a younger guy and allow him to kind of constantly feed off of that and be a sponge beyond more than just the time at the rink. So that certainly, I think, goes a long way. There's not really anybody off the top of my head veteran wise that would be kind of qualified in that respect, not from the Russian perspective of it, because there's just nobody on the team that I can think of that has that level of experience. You're kind of limited to Zamula, Fedotov, and Fedotov with barely any experience himself, still kind of getting a feel for it. The one thing I think Fedotov and maybe Michkov could relate to is going through hardships of getting there. I think that could be something that they could bond over, but I don't know if you're going to Fedotov and saying, hey, show him the ropes of being an NHLer when you've got 3 NHL games to your name. That's not really going to solve that at all. So maybe that's the way you approach, if he comes over, maybe that's part of the approach to free agency, is maybe there's a guy who has some of that veteran experience that you can get on the lower scale of things, that you're kind of saying, listen, just follow this guy around, let him kind of direct you on how things work in North America, the lifestyle, the culture change, all of that type of stuff, and see where it goes. And I wouldn't be shocked if some, beyond, like, we're kind of trying to focus it in more from a locker room perspective, that this goes beyond the locker room perspective with developmental staff and maybe even into the front office, because we've seen the involvement level that Keith Jones and Danny Briere have had. And there's times where it feels a little bit hands-on with players at times. Maybe they have involvement too in this and helping kind of bring people along and kind of being that, listen, what do you need? What can we do to help kind of mentality? So I think it could come from all sorts of ends. The lineup question is certainly something I've kind of pondered as long as this has been out there. What would happen if this were to happen? And it's why I think that we're not going to wait too long to find out kind of whether or not October is on the table for Michkov, because the Flyers need to know. I think they need to be able to operate this offseason with some form of knowledge that you have your top prospect coming into the picture or not. And that's what would interest me. I think that there's one direction that they could and should take if they know he's not coming over and you've got another year of kind of the true rebuild process and trying to follow that mold as best as possible. If he comes over, I think that there's at least certain parts of your offseason that fundamentally change, because you have to consider what kind of talent he is and trying to give him the best situation possible if he's going to play. So I've already kind of speculated in the back of my mind that there's a possibility that Danny Briere gets creative this offseason in one way, shape, or form to maybe address that center position or try to do something along the lines of the types of trades that kind of the type of trade that you would have to make to bring in a player that feels a little bit, I don't want to completely say exactly like Jamie Drysdale, but a little bit like that, where you go, okay, here's a guy who's not overly experienced at the NHL level, but does have falls into that younger age bracket, fills a position of need, gets the team younger, gets the team more skilled kind of right off the bat, just on paper. And then you want to get your hands on that player to see what you can do with them and see if the change of scenery helps and all that type of stuff. That was certainly a unique situation, the Drysdale trade, because I think there was way less moving parts in that one than to just go with Cutter Gauthier and a pick. So I think that there were more moving parts in anything they would do. But I think, like, I kind of bridge the gap between that trade, the Drysdale trade, and the Ivan Provorov trade, where there was a lot of moving parts to it, and we saw the creativity that Danny Briere can have doing something like that. So I wonder if what they would try to do falls somewhere in the middle, that it's not something as complex as what the Provorov deal was, but it's not something that's as straightforward as Cutter Gauthier doesn't want to play here. He gets involved in a trade, and you get Jamie Drysdale and a draft pick back. Like, I don't think it's that straightforward either. But I wonder if if kind of the odds of something like that happening, I already thought it was possible even before all the Michkov stuff. If Michkov is indeed coming over, I wonder how much the possibility of something like that happening goes higher because of having a player of Michkov's caliber be in the lineup as soon as next season, and just what that would do. And then I would be curious about the free agency approach. I don't know if this offseason, just because he's coming over, is the time to, first of all, is the time to throw money out there anyway, one, and two, if they even have the money now to do that. But it would at least set the stage for kind of making you think about, where can you get more money? Who would you move to get more money? If it shapes the whole offseason. If he comes over, it shapes the whole offseason, because maybe you decide to ride out a contract that you don't mind having the money tied up for one more year, and you don't want to get caught and do buyouts and trade retention and all that type of stuff. You don't want to go down that path and have more on your books than you have to for longer than you have to. But what happens if he's coming over and you now have to explore these possibilities if you want to bring anybody in that enhances your lineup and changes maybe some of the high-end talent that you're lacking beyond just Michkov that you could add? And certainly at the center position, I think, is the headliner of the group, because we could look defensively, and I know that beyond, because right away when we talk about centers and high-end talent and trades and getting creative, I feel like Trevor Zegras' name just naturally follows into that. And I'm not suggesting that that's the only guy they could do this for, but it's the first name that seems to constantly be there. In the same sense that if anybody brings up defensemen right now, I think that the common name that keeps getting linked to the Flyers is Jacob Chychrun. It doesn't mean that that's the guy that they would go after per se, but it's just one of these things. that keeps coming up. And I kind of keep wondering about, from the defensive position, you've got some years and some money tied up into certain defensemen that are going to play next year. You've got the years tied up now into Travis Sanheim and Nick Seeler, and you've got the money, at least some good money, tied up into Cam York and Jamie Drysdale, who are going to eventually need new contracts in relatively short order. York's up after next year, and Drysdale's got 2 years left on his deal, and then you're going to have to revisit those guys. And if they are as big of a part of the future as we've been led to believe, based on everything that everyone seems to say, then you're going to have to factor that in as well. So maybe you don't explore the defenseman side of it, and you do explore more of the forward side in the trade market, because I just don't know where you're going to fit another defenseman, quite honestly. You've got a lot of.
Yeah. Let me interject something. I want to go back to the point before we move on. A name just popped into my mind. Another update. There is a water heater break in Yardley, PA, that will keep our buddy Chef from coming. He will not make it tonight. Just thought I'd give you that update. So we'll catch Chef and the great Dan Silver in the next show. But Artem Anisimov, is he playing hockey anywhere? Because they added him as like an advisor.
Mm-hmm.
That would seem to be like a perfect guy. I heard nothing but positives, and he had an up and down career, like in terms of injuries, and he was a little recalcitrant early in his career, and he really learned from it, and he played for Torts, and just seems to fit the perfect mold of somebody, even if he's not on the ice, somebody who could play a mentor role for somebody like Michkov.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I just pulled it up. He played for Hartford in the AHL this past season, but didn't play a lot. Only played 18 games. So I'm wondering if I don't see anything immediately on here that says he would have formally retired, but I wonder if his playing career is indeed over, if the Flyers maybe wouldn't try to do something from a developmental side with him and see if he couldn't kind of coach Michkov up a little bit just in terms of that lifestyle. Absolutely, it would be a possibility. Yeah. Okay. So I got a little bit more on it now. So he was on a professional tryout with Hartford and was released in February. So, and that's the last that anybody knows of anything of him playing. So it's a possibility. I mean, if you want to go down that route and even see if he's, the one kind of catch is I don't know that they would put him in an NHL lineup. He definitely has been more AHL lately, and he had a really solid year the 1 year he played for the Phantoms. So that is a plus. And obviously the other parts of the equation is he would also know the coaching style that the Flyers are going forward with. He played for John Tortorella. He knows, it's not like there's any secrets there between, if you had Anisimov kind of as a guide for Michkov, there wouldn't be any secrets about what it would be like.
Yeah, I'm not even talking about as a player anymore, because
exactly. If he's past the point of playing and retires, essentially, that's why I think maybe you do reach out and see about a developmental role in some way. I mean, we've seen a lot of guys who you try to match up those backgrounds, I think about Semu Tuamala and his relationship with Sami Kapanen and how that kind of helps bridge that gap as well and help make some adjustments. So yeah, if you can find somebody who really can help in that respect, absolutely. Development is key in this whole thing. And Michkov's not going to, as talented as he may be, he's not going to come over here and be a finished product. So having somebody who can work with him a little bit beyond the traditional coaching staff and things of that nature would be huge for him.
Yeah, definitely. But we were getting into the centers and some options, and you mentioned Zegras, and I mean there was some talk as when he was struggling. Now it seems impossible. Anton Lundell.
Right.
Florida, what you wouldn't.
I think it feels like Anton Lundell has been a little bit replaced with. There's been a lot about Martin Nakash lately,
right?
And if he were to be on the trading block, would the Flyers be interested in that respect? And I certainly can understand when you're lacking centers like the Flyers are. You're probably going to hear them connected to just about every center whose name comes out, just over the possibility of anything. But yeah, that's you're right about Lundell though.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about him, because Lundell would seem like, he's got 2 deep playoff runs now. So, I mean, he's whatever funk he was in, he played much better in the second half of the year. I mean, the thing about Natchez is that he came up as a center, but he spent 5 years on the wing.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked somebody who watches prospects, doesn't think he can make it at center in the NHL. I guess, wouldn't that be like the factor? I mean, he's a big guy, but he skates well. He's got a lot of attributes you like, but this team is loaded with wings as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not getting a center out of him, then is he better than just, Konechny? Probably not. Is he probably the same level as Tippett? Yeah. It's just whether you think it would. I mean, is that how you feel about it?
Yeah, one of the things I've always liked about Nakesh as he's come up is, kind of is the product of the team he plays on too. Like he's felt like, and I understand, like, kind of part of the talk is that he doesn't necessarily feel like his role has been perfect. But nonetheless, he's had success in Carolina because of some of the players that are able to be around him. And that kind of factors in too. I mean, if you have enough, like the Flyers do, if you have enough wingers that all kind of fit, not necessarily fit the same mold, but do fit kind of the same statistic profile, because we're starting to get into that territory. If you bring him into this picture a little bit, then, is it going to be as effective? Because they're not all going to be able to play with the same line. You're not going to have three wingers on a line if you tried to bring Tippett, Konechny, and Nakesh together, unless you made Nakesh a center. And that's the thing. Like, it's if he's not able to adjust to that, and if he hasn't played it for so long that he's not great at that position, then you're just stuck with another guy who's better on the wing than he is at center, even though he might be able to take the occasional face off, and you're back to square one. So
right,
you really do have to be careful about the options, and you really do have to be careful about, if you're going to make a trade, to do this, especially if you're going to make the trade in the wake of any Michkov news, knowing where Mishkov's probably going to play. Like I brought up a few weeks back when kind of that was heating up a little bit more and more, Michkov wouldn't be coming over to play on the fourth line, or shouldn't be, at least. I would never hold anything past John Tortorella, but he shouldn't be playing on the fourth line, and probably would immediately factor into, at minimum, your top six, if not your top line, just because you're going to want to play him with some frequency. As long as he doesn't, he kind of becomes one of these cases. I remember saying this about Tyson Forrester last season going through training camp. Unless he falls flat on his face in training camp, I don't know how he wouldn't make it in some capacity. So that's the way I feel about Michkov, is that unless he totally came over and in his first trial runs of anything looked like he couldn't adjust and just wasn't able to do much of any, especially in preseason games where he's going to play competition. It's not fully NHL competition, and he's played in the KHL for the last handful of years. Like, if he doesn't have some form of success in the preseason to, beyond the adjustment process and things like that, then he probably isn't cut out for the NHL right away, if he's not able to do that right away. So that's why I'm saying he would absolutely have to completely squander that opportunity if he wasn't to make the team. So, but it does keep adding to the logjam of wingers, and you've latched yourself into a couple, and then I wonder, I don't know if this is what, if this is a byproduct of, because the Michkov talk really wasn't happening yet when this was still speculation. I think we even maybe even talked about this the last time I was on, was kind of the Joel Farabee portion of this equation, and whether he would be a trade chip this offseason, or at least somebody that they would listen on. Because when you think about some of the guys they have locked up long-term on the wing, they just locked up Tippett, and Travis Konechny is going to be a big talking point as the offseason progresses. So with those two in mind, and Farabee's not on some short-term deal right now either. He's got some years left, obviously. So you start to think about those guys, and is, bringing Michkov into this picture, if you also make Konechny a priority, that could be your, is that your top six wingers for the foreseeable future? That's what you're asking yourself potentially. And that's why you have to really consider what you would do elsewhere, and what you would move one of those guys for, or who you would target if you did move one of those guys to get something else of need, that kind of thing.
And Farabee's not there. I mean, he's not part of this regime. He wasn't even drafted by Flair as part of the Fletcher administration or regime or whatever. So Farabee started off well, and we all know how it went for Joel. His numbers look good in terms of Corsi and things like that, but it went kind of sideways, and you kind of wonder if he's maybe could use a change. I don't like throwing away young players. He's still a young guy. He's signed through 2028. But again, the question becomes, okay, you have a lot of right-handed guys on the team. The one left-handed guy who's playing in the top 6 is Joel Farabee.
Mhm.
But you do have Michkov, who's left-handed, but he plays on his right side.
Yeah.
Would he be shifted over? And then you have Forster. Now, I guess he could play either side.
They've tried almost all of them on either side, as far as I can remember. I know Tippett's played on both sides before, kind of
Mhm.
as they went back and forth. Mostly, I think one of the reasons why most of them have played on both sides is because when you're trying to figure out a combination that starts to really work with some consistency, that you don't have just, for how many games in a row last season will we sit there and go, okay, Travis Konechny's clearly the hottest player on the team. He's scoring pretty much every game for 5-6 games. So he's going to get a bulk of the minutes. And then when that fades, and it's Owen Tippett's turn, and then Tippett's getting a lot more minutes. And Forrester had that little stretch of time where he was coming up with kind of goal after goal after goal for a while. He, went from, I believe, what did he go from 6 to 14 or 15 in a span of like just under a month, or about a month.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it kind of goes off of that. It's interesting you say that too, because at least according to the way Cap Friendly has it, Tippett's listed as both a left and a right. Farabee's listed as both left and right. Konechny's listed as both left and right, and Forster's only listed as a right winger. But I'm pretty sure they did give him a look on the left side.
Yes.
And because I can definitely remember him barreling down the left wing. With some of the burst that he's been able to show over the last year, he definitely got better at that. Yeah, you've got some interesting combinations there, and then you really, it's hard to ignore the thinness at center that goes along with it. Like you've got a bunch of options there. Like the fact that we can also go beyond the Tippett, Konechny, Farabee. What happens if Michkov comes into the picture, and not bring up beyond, that's 2 lines worth of wingers right there. And we haven't even mentioned Forster before a couple minutes ago. And with the type of season Forster had, Forster very much kind of, to me, the way his season went, almost kind of assumes the role of Joel Farabee from his rookie year and what that could turn into. Because it was the same kind of thing. Farabee had a great rookie year, and then great rookie year and second year, and it's what happens after that. And so he's one of my guys that I'm most curious about seeing in the following season, and what kind of role they move him into. I mean, look, there's nothing wrong if you're deep enough at wing and decide to keep moving forward with all these guys, Michkov included, if he happens to come over, that Joel Farabee's on your third line because you just have that much depth, and that's the 4 guys that are better than him. There's nothing wrong with that if it's affordable and stays within the cap. There is going to be something wrong if you can't kind of fill some of the center void, because it's going to be hard to see those wingers have the level of success you think they're capable of when there's that missing link is there. And that's what I think a lot of the concern is that for all the wingers that they do have, is it possible that Joel Farabee is included in something to help you get a center that makes it a little bit more sustainable in terms of applying some offense to this picture?
All right.
Maybe
Yeah,
that's a possibility.
let me freeze it there, because this kind of encapsulates a couple different questions.
Sure.
If Farabee is the guy, maybe you could go to a team like Buffalo, who has 3 centers. I mean, they have Tage Thompson, Dylan Cousins, and Zach Benson. That's pretty solid. And then they also have Peyton Krebs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how high the ceiling is on Peyton Krebs. I'm not super excited. Of course, we always get excited about the kids that haven't made the NHL yet, because it's always it's a mystery. They have Yuri Kulich, Noah Osland, and of course Matt Savoy. Matt Savoy seems like a third liner, but I'm really not sure.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying those are the players that the Flyers would target.
Right.
Moving on from a Farabee, moving on from a Lawton or what have you. And Lawton is a guy who's been rumored, supposedly on the lips of Buffalo, looking for that kind of player. But that would be the kind of player, I would think, whether it's with them or other organization, the Flyers, if they were going to dip into the younger pool, some guys that have some experience that could possibly step into the NHL, that kind of makes sense. And then you get into the other tier, well, Zegras. Well, you don't get Zegras and that kind of potential. Zegras, I'd say he's like a better version of Farabee. I mean, at least offensively, he just seems to have a higher ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
Then you ask yourself, well, wait a minute, are we going to have to part with a guy like Travis Konechny to get him? And with all the wingers we already have, to get a guy like Zegras, wouldn't that make more sense with the age and everything involved? And then it gets you into the cultural things and how to kind of like in against that backdrop, how do you mix all these things in a collage that works to try to get them to where they want to go in a couple years?
Yeah, it's and all valid questions, and I think the hard part of the conversation that you're talking about, especially if you go to an Anaheim and talk about Zegras and what happens if it requires more than say Farabee, like a Konechny. I think the challenge with Konechny compared to somebody like Farabee is the level of consistency at which you can kind of expect what you're going to get production wise. Like, I know that there's definitely a hot debate, obviously, about Konechny's future and the possibility of a contract extension, and primarily given his age, that's just natural. He's gonna, by the time the contract would kick in, he'll be 28, and you would have to kind of, are you willing to go that 8 years on him and go into the mid to late 30s with him? And for the short term, you can kind of understand where you're coming from with this, because Konechny's given you 30, between 30 and 33 goals the last 2 seasons. Finally started to kind of build that. He was on track for 30 a couple other times in his career, with not reaching because of things out of his control. The COVID year, he was great. And then the season shut down and he was kind of halted from getting anywhere close to 30. But that's what he's capable of. And I feel like the Flyers did something relatively similar in this respect with Owen Tippett, in terms of, okay, Tippett's had 2 seasons now, 27, 28 goals. He's close to that 30 mark. And you get him on a contract that's at $6.2 million per, which, when you can look at it in the future and sit there and say, okay, 8 years down the line, how's $6.2 million going to look 8 years down the line? And Tippett's 25 and the contract kicks in at that age, pretty much, that now you're starting to make sense with that, right? Like that you're getting Tippett for the prime years, 25, 26, 27, 28 into his early 30s, and at a cap hit that as it ages is probably going to look pretty good. It's a different argument with Konechny when you start at 28 and you're looking at a number that is not at 6.2 or anywhere close to that. It's going to be way higher. So that's the thing you weigh. And I think it's a hard decision to make because of the fact that Konechny kind of offers you a consistent package in terms of the production is relatively consistent. You know what kind of player you're getting, and the value is going to naturally be higher also for him because he was just put into your leadership group. So that factors in also. But you do factor in, again, it's the constant back and forth that they have to have with truly rebuilding or taking a shot with it. And it's why the Michkov thing matters so much to me in this offseason planning, is because if you've got Matvei Michkov as part of this thing and you're bringing him in at his age and assuming that, that he's going to take to this seamlessly, then maybe you don't mind having a Travis Konechny around as one of the veteran guys that you kind of commit to, because you haven't committed to a ton of players beyond those next 2 seasons that you thought you weren't going to have Michkov. You kind of teetered on that line of, as long as it's done within 2 years, we're okay. But here comes that opportunity. And you're really not going to have, I don't think you're going to wait on this. You're not going to sit there and with Konechny, you're not going to sit back and say, let's just let it play out. Let's let the season start. And maybe we have a conversation in January like we did with Tippett. I don't think that that's going to happen, because I think you're walking down a dangerous path of what the price tag could go to if he has a really good start to his year, for one. And then 2, I think you lose the opportunity to trade him at full value going into this year, knowing that someone will get that opportunity. So it's really, you've got to make up your mind whether or not, there's only 2 paths to take. Either you give him the extension and you go long-term and you commit to him being a leader and commit to the consistency of what he brings, or you trade him and get the value back that you think can help you move forward in some direction, whether that is through player trade to get somebody of substantial value that could really naturally fall right into your top 6 in a center position, let's say, or it's back to kind of that futures play where you get some significant assets that you can utilize down the road too, one way or the other. I would assume you try to bridge the gap on that a little bit. Maybe if we were talking, and not that, like you mentioned, Buffalo's been way more, talkative about Lawton, I would say, than Konechny. But if, let's say, it was Konechny that you were talking to a team like Buffalo about, Would you do Konechny kind of in, if Krebs is not the most highly touted of the centers, but there was Krebs and draft picks or another prospect of some kind, that it turns into a bigger package deal is what I'm kind of getting at. That
Right. I know they like it.
Then you would entertain it a little bit more than just the best you can get is a guy who maybe doesn't crack the third line for a player who's clearly in your top 6 and is going to be as pretty much as long as you give him that contract extension. If you go that direction, that's kind of where I'm going with it too.
Yeah, I'm not saying that I would do this, but if you're looking at Konechny and all you're getting back is Peyton Krebs, you're going to want another player. I
Right.
know a player the Flyers like or seem to like, from what I've heard, is Matthias Samuelsson.
And that would be
And-
interesting if they got kind of both as the package deal, and maybe there's even a pick thrown in beyond that too. Like
Right. It would have to if you get a player like Konechny who's at the top of his game and it's go time in Buffalo, you got to pay for go time. So you give up Peyton Krebs, who they don't need. I mean, to me, I would want more. I would want one of those kids I mentioned earlier who's got the higher ceiling.
right.
Because you're getting a premier player, an all-star in Konechny. Matthias Samuelsson, he's Shell's son. He's hurt a lot, and
Yeah.
that's been a problem. But they're having kids that are slow out of the gate at any position, but on defense, whatever, that they really like this kid. And he seems to have a little bit more puck skill than his father ever did. And I know they like him. He's a big left-handed defensive defenseman with some good puck moving skill. I mean, that's a possibility. And then we're talking about another maybe first-round draft pick. Although I don't know what Buffalo is picking. What this year they do have their first-round draft pick, and yeah, they have a higher pick than we do. I don't have the order right in front of me, but. Yeah, so I mean, there's it's not crazy to come up, but frankly, if I were going to get rid of Travis Konechny and move on from him because of the cultural element, I would really, really want to meet a need and go for something a little more solid, like a Zegras. And Zegras, in some eyes, is really not a great center. He might have a better career at left wing, but I don't know. This is where you rely on your pro scouts and
for sure. And it's why I'm really hardened about like that idea of it. Like I get this, like, that's why I get the sense that Farabee feels like more of the guy that they would shop a little more aggressively. I think that they value as much as I don't think, based on like the early ask that we've heard about of what Konechny would be looking for in an extension, I do think the Flyers value him highly in terms of the leadership position and all of that type of stuff. I don't think that they would, negotiations start at one point and usually kind of come back down a little bit from the player side, even just a little bit. The comparison to Timo Meier's contract is really good. I kind of tend to lean like naturally another year down the line from what Meier got, you're going to get a little higher than that. I tend to totally lean in that 9.25 range probably for him. I don't know if and I don't know if you go there, like that's the hard part is I don't know if you go there with that for another guy, like, especially if there's not much more of a ceiling than what you've seen to this point in terms of production. But again, you're factoring in total package, and I start to have the conversation, like when I talk about this a little bit, I start to have the conversation with Konechny that we always seem to have when we talk about Scott Lawton too. That it's not just about what the number of goals or the number of points. It's locker room. It's all the intangibles. It's him being a menace on the ice and the way that he kind of brings that energy to a game and can try to get under the skin of the opponent. Those are things that get factored in as well beyond just paying for the points basically.
Yeah, no, I get that, but at the end of last year, and I think there's no doubt Tortorella played a role in this. Some of those guys didn't deliver when they really needed it, and they went through that skid. And as much as I really believe in that, I don't know if I'd pass up the opportunity to kind of start moving on from some of those guys, because I think there's three pillars of leaders on the team that come to mind. And if I'm missing somebody, just let me know. But I look at Couturier and Lawton and Konechny, and there's like your main leadership group, at least up front. On the back line, I think, maybe Nick Seeler in kind of a way, because of who he is and how he earned it, kind of like almost like a Barry Ashby story. And I can say that as someone who watched Ashby play. I'm not just reading in a book. I was a fan at that time. There's some similarity. A guy was going to quit. Ashby toiled in the minors for like 8 or 9 years. And barely even got a chance. And then he just became a mainstay. And Sealer was going to quit too. So I'm just, he's part of that as well. And that's a good thing. But I think, maybe you're right, though. Maybe Michkov is the deciding factor about whether they go move a Farabee or they move a Konechny in a bolder move, because they want to kind of make sure that Michkov is somebody at a higher level to play with.
Right. And to me, Farabee's inconsistencies were greater than Konechny's, and Konechny battled some injury down the stretch too, so that was a little bit of a factor as well.
Yeah.
Those things to me, like that's why I kind of come down to Farabee gave you these 2 really great years out of the gate, and then has kind of leveled off a lot in the last handful of years, and by my eyes had a really good start to this past season too, until again everything kind of hit a wall, and there was big scoring droughts and not being able to produce, and that's going to come into play a little bit with this, certainly, and that's why I also think like it is hard to just give away or move a player who's in his age bracket at this stage of things still, because you just don't want to end up, even if the change of scenery is the best thing possible for him, you don't want to be the team that has to supply the change of scenery and essentially give up on him at 25. You just don't want to play that card 24, 25 years old. That's why you're targeting guys, like you look at the extension that they gave to Tippett. You've seen a couple, you saw 1 year of promise. You wanted to see a second year of it repeated, and you do it, you give them the contract extension. That was kind of what they did with Farabee too, to an extent, because Farabee's whole current contract was based off of those first 2 years as well.
Right. You
saw some consistency, and now it hasn't been there as much. And you're going to have you're going to have players in the future that you're going to play this same game with. Tyson Forster's a restricted free agent after next season. You're going to have to play that card with him. Is he going to give you that level of production again next season? Guy went out and scored 20 goals ultimately. He got himself to a nice round number on the season. Can he do it again? You have to find that out before I think you're just handing him something more than your typical RFA bridge deal that we tend to see for a guy who's of Forrester's age. They're going to have this conversation with Cam York.
Yes, that's just
when that comes up. And Cam York had a very significant season in terms of progress and kind of finding a niche on this team and finding a role on this team. But he's going to have to do it year over year. It can't just be have a great year, get your contract, and then it goes back to kind of regresses back to the mean here. If there's a regression back to a mean, then you may not want to latch yourself too long term to anybody who, where the mean is less than what you saw at their absolute best for 1 year. You just want to make
sure. We saw that with Sanheim.
Exactly. And the thing is that, even with Sanheim's contract, there's still ways to work around it. Sanheim's contract falls into the same category as Tippett's to an extent, where it's like, down the road, if you can find that natural place for him, like Sanheim to me is a natural fit on a second pairing.
Yeah.
And would work well there. And ultimately, if that's what he turns out to be, I don't get that freaked out over the cap hit number, because that's typically what second pairing guys have been going for lately. You're not paying him like Erik Karlsson. You're paying him like most of the second pairing guys in the league. But someone's going to have to assume that role of top pair and be able to do it for the whole year, not just what you got from last season when everything seemed to be clicking perfectly, when everything, up until the trade deadline, basically. So that's where some of these decisions come in. And if you're going to go down that path, it also makes the conversation to me interesting because of the fact that Farabee has term left. So you have to make that negotiation. And again, that to me is also where the question of the, kind of when, if Michkov comes over into this picture, how much do you want to tie up if you were trying to improve the other positions? If Farabee becomes, let's say, if Farabee were the centerpiece of a trade that involved a center of some kind that you're interested in, are you going to be able to just trade the remaining years of the contract, all those years at $5 million per, or is there going to be retention involved? And then if there's retention involved, is it something you can actually handle from a cap perspective to still become a better team over the years that are really going to matter, which are those 3 years that you would have Michkov on entry level money? That's when it's going to matter the most. And because if everything goes according to plan with Michkov, he's going to make the minimum that he's supposed to make on an entry level for 3 years. And then the sky's the limit after that. Who knows?
Yeah, then you're talking 10 million, whatever, if he's as good as we thought, right?
Exactly. And that's when you start to ask that question about what you're giving Konechny, but also if you're willing to trade Farabee, it kind of has to be for the full thing or nothing at all, because how do you retain salary for as many years are left on that contract and still expect to be able to become players when Mishkov's off of that entry level deal? You get the luxury of that for only so long, where he's on the entry level money. Kind of just like what you're going to ride into talking about the other two guys we just brought up, what you're riding with Forster and York right now. Cam York's making $1.6 million. I feel pretty safe in saying he won't make that the next contract out. And certainly Tyson Forster, on the final year of his entry level coming into this season, he won't be making that after next season if he repeats what he just did. He'll be probably making close to that Joel Farabee figure, to be honest, if he repeats the 20 goal thing.
Yeah. I would think, right, 4.5, 5 million, depending on if he steps up, or if he's the same, then he's probably in that 4.5, 5 million range.
Yeah, and if it goes higher, you're probably approaching the Tippett number. Yeah,
right, exactly. And with York, it's a little different because he's arbitration eligible, and that can be a little sticky.
Yeah.
So, but I think there was a discussion whether York and his deal is, if there's urgency, or do you need to see more from York? I could see it both ways in terms of how much you really believe in him. But I could also see, hey, defensemen are different. Let's be more patient. We saw how Sanheim went and all that.
Right. And I one of the things I'll say about that is that I've really liked the way that Danny Briere has handled some of the mid-season extensions and trying to bridge this gap. The timing, to let Tippett kind of go out and repeat some of what he was doing the year before, and then decide now is the right time to do this. It wasn't, they didn't follow the Sanheim path and say, look at that one great season he had, let's just throw it all at him. And I feel similarly about kind of like, I look at that timeline. I feel a little similarly about kind of what they did with Sam Ersson too, about that you got some taste of what he could provide, and you didn't go big with there's also an element where it doesn't have to be 6, 7, 8 years all the time,
right.
With Ersson, with Ersson, they timed it out really nicely. They gave him a 2-year extension early. Didn't have to do it at that given moment, but you kept it at a nice price tag for you, so you could see a little more and see if the consistency matches up. And that there's an element where they did that with York a little bit with this most recent round, but you've kind of gotten what you wanted to see from that. I think already you've seen part of it, and I think I would exactly follow that method. How much of it can you repeat next season? It's not something I would necessarily put on the to-do list this offseason, but I would not be opposed to, if he's having the level, especially if he commits to the role that he was playing at the end of last season, where he's really the blocking shots and the ability to contribute offensively like he was at times. If he's that player for the first half of this season, and you get to that all-star break period where you start to feel like, okay, we could get ahead of some business here and maybe do something that works for both sides. It's a raise for him. It would be enough of a team friendly number that you're not going crazy over it. Maybe, and it depends on the term too, obviously. If you go the full 8 with him, or do you go something smaller, it's more of a bridge. All up for negotiation and all up for discussion, but I would not put it on my off-season to-do list. I think that's more of a, let's see how the season starts. If it's going really well, revisit it mid-season and go from there.
Yeah, agreed. Let's talk about a couple guys. I'm hearing from Anthony DeMarco from thefourthperiod.com that both Zamula and Ginning should be contending for a spot, competing for a spot.
on the team next year. I think Jennings kind of floated that thing out there because he wasn't really getting a chance. And then he did get a chance and he looked pretty decent. I worry about his mobility, but then again, the catch-up speed of Zamula is outstandingly not good. So those guys could be competing for the same spot, depending, it depends on the mix. So what is the future? I'm going to pick three guys.
Okay.
Delorier,
Mm-hmm.
totally different. They're all different.
Okay.
Bobby Brink and Rasmus Ristolainen.
Okay, Delorier falls into an interesting category for me because Delorier falls into this category for me right now that I include Cam Atkinson in and I include Cal Peterson in because these are guys that you would think about buying out potentially if the time came in. And Anthony also had the Cal Peterson's probably not going to be bought out, which I agree with, by the way. I think that's the right direction. He's going to get buried in the minors. You also got to remember what he's here for. And I'm not talking about from on ice perspective. The reason he's a Flyer or in the organization was to help you get the first round pick that you used in last year's draft. So if you're watching the Memorial Cup and enjoying Oliver Bonk, you can partially thank Cal Peterson as part of being in that trade that got you the second first round pick. That was important. And I think you just live with that $3.85 million cap hit if it's buried in the minors and let it ride it out. I bring Cam Atkinson into that because Cam Atkinson's got obviously a higher cap hit than that. And you're not going to bury that in the minors. So what do you do with him? And he's a prime buyout candidate. But I wonder if Michkov does not come over, if you not reconsider that, but if you wonder what your prospects for this one season are. It's the short-term versus long-term thinking of it. If you don't let yourself get too consumed in one season, especially if Mishkov's not part of it. Like if Michkov comes over, then I think you're rethinking a lot of things because you're trying to build your future with him in it. And it's just ahead of schedule. But if he's still on schedule based on everything that we are thinking of, do you even bother to play, especially now that there's been a little bit of hints that he could come over earlier? If it's not next season, do you even bring a second year of cap money into this from a buyout? Or do you just sit there and say, maybe Cam Atkinson's the 13th forward this year and you ride it out? He could be in and out. You ride out that year with the cap. You don't go crazy in free agency or go crazy on the trade market as much, maybe if there's nothing that makes sense, and you ride it out because there's certain contracts like Ryan Johansson's in this a little bit too, because Johansson's will get buried probably on LTIR, but it's one year. You may just have to eat some of this right now to get from 1 year to the next, where Atkinson's off the books, Peterson's off the books, Johansson's off the books. And the reason I bring up Delorier is because Delorier's contract, the cap hit doesn't even come close to those other three when you look at it, $1.75 million. But you also wonder about what his role is long-term and where he really fits in this picture and all that. And that's why I wonder, you don't want to get into, I just don't know if you want to get into a buyout with 2 years left on the contract that turns into even more.
Yeah.
So do you ride out a year with him and then maybe revisit that another year from now? The buyout on him with 1 year left is much easier to take than what it would be for Atkinson or for Peterson or anybody in that vein. And that's kind of going to allow me to segue to another name in your picture here, because you could bring up Ristolainen in that as well, in terms of, what would it be like to buy out his contract? And you don't want to do it with 3 years left, obviously. That would create a lot of problems. So, the trade conversation comes up heavily with him. And I just find it hard to believe they're going to find a good partner for a trade for a guy who didn't play that much in the second half of the season and really at all down the stretch once he was out for good. So I don't know if there's even going to be a partner. Do you kind of almost have to factor him into your lineup just so he can play, just so he can be potentially moved down the line? He's an interesting one, because when I start to paint that picture of the of the defensive lineup, Sanheim, Sealer, Drysdale, York, they're all in it. Zamula and Jinning are competing for a spot. Don't forget Ronnie Attard's in this picture a little bit too for a potential spot. And
Emil Andre a year away, maybe.
Emil Andre's going to try to, and he might believe that, from last year when he got a little trial run at the beginning of last season, that he might think he's more ready now than he was last year. And he might want to have something to say about that competition in camp too. And then you got Ristolainen in there. So, it's really hard when if I have to take Ristolainen in this, let's say, and make him the number 5 automatically just because of contract status, let's just say, to then sit there and try to play the final spot with Zamula, Attard, Jinning, Andre. Now we're back up to the 9 defensemen, 6 spots conversation. And
yeah,
and I don't, Jinning's the really interesting one to me. Zamula, they don't, they know what they face with Zamula, because Zamula the whole year was, not waiver exempt anymore. So you would have to pass him through waivers. He was kind of stuck on the roster, and he would either be in the lineup, out of the lineup, that kind of thing. And they had the luxury with everybody else to kind of go call him up, send him down, figure out a way. Eventually, that's going to go away, and you're going to be stuck with guys who are either NHL or bust, or you got to run them through waivers, and you just got to make a decision on some of these guys. So I'm curious. Maybe it doesn't matter. There's always been a lot of love for Ristolainen, in terms of what kind of player he can be when he's fully healthy and when he's fully engaged and all of that type of stuff. So maybe somebody out there is actually interested in it. But again, that brings that kind of, it's interesting how many years are left on that deal too, that it's at 3, because it's making me think of Kevin Hayes again and what you had to do with Kevin Hayes' contract last year.
Yes.
Like, you just don't want to go down that road where you're tied up for 2 to 3 more years with more money than you need to be tied down with. You can either resolve that situation smoothly and without any tracks left behind, or you are probably stuck with the guy. And that's the unfortunate nature of that's the part of Danny Briere's job that no one should be envious of, is the cleaning up the mess that was left behind beforehand part.
Well, it gets tricky because, the cap goes up to 87.7 in this upcoming season, and it's going to roughly be 92 million if everything goes okay for 25-26. But to opening night, I mean, you have some players like Brink. We're not sure if he's going to make the team or not, depending on who gets moved out. And Forster are waiver exempt. How are they going to be cap compliant? How are they going to? What do you think they're going to just almost make it so they have to move somebody, or?
Well, yeah, that's where it gets tricky, right? Like, part of the equation, especially when you bring Ristolainen's money back into the picture. That's where it really gets tricky, because while you've got those other guys kind of waiver exempt, like you brought up, like whatever you're going to do with Brink, it's not going to, as an RFA, it's not going to break the bank immensely that it should cause problems, just like with Forrester, just like with any of those other guys kind of at the bottom. Right. It's not going to be anything overly substantial. The 2 natural spots that how are the easy answer to how are they, and the problem is they got to be cap compliant before they do the LTIR part. So that's another key to this thing. So the first 2 obvious answers are, one comes from Cam Atkinson being a buyout candidate, because you just bite the bullet on that, because you may need it to get cap compliant. Or we go back into our trade candidate conversation and the money that either Travis Konechny or Joel Farabee are making. That would probably be another source of the cap money that could be in there. And I would lump in, I'd lump in Scott Lawton too, just because I'm not completely certain about him. Not in the sense that they love him or anything like that, but when you start thinking about guys who maybe can fetch you what you want, if you've got to move a player and you've got to think about what's going to get you the best return, you're going to come back to the same avenues that have produced a lot of conversation, and Konechny's produced conversation. So you'll come back to that avenue because it has, and Lawton's produced conversation. So you'll probably come back to that. And Farabee's going to produce conversation. So you probably come back to that. It's not going to be, I'll lump Morgan Frost into that too, even because Morgan Frost has produced conversation, and it's on the lower scale end. It's $2.1 million, but it's still something. And again, it's a centerman, so you want to be careful about that. But everything's
you gotta be careful
but
about
everything's got a price when you're going to go into something like that. And if you've got to find a way to both be cap compliant and you're trying to improve your team, you've got to ask yourself among some of these guys, who do you move if you're going to move a player? Who do you move and what do you move them for to still stay within that? Because you got to find a way to balance it all out and make it work. And they get a lot of relief after next season, but that's where you have to ask yourself, where do they go with this? I mean, is it possible to get cap compliant also, that one of the things they could do is quite literally come into camp with the roster as we see it and put Cam Atkinson on waivers, pass him through, assuming nobody takes him, move all the LTIR money where it could go, and then bring him right back because now it would fit possibly. But I like I've said with Atkinson, because as much as I wonder if they would skip the buyout with Atkinson, I just feel like that's always been the most logical path, especially when we keep having this conversation about the cap money. It just feels like
it's just getting to opening night, because
Right.
you got Ellis and Johansson.
Right. And like to go back and like actually look at what he would save them and all that type of stuff if they bought him out and things like that. Like, you're talking about getting, saving $3.5 million. Well, let's this way. At that point in time, what you're doing right there is you're almost working with all of Johansson's contract that's going to end up on LTIR anyway, just to be able to fit that into the picture, and then that goes beyond anything else that you try to do. But it's complicated. And the thing is that it's complicated. Or at least it feels really complicated kind of just for this year, because once some of those guys are off of the books completely, you do have
They're
a
in
lot
good
of
shape.
flexibility, and you do have, they're not, if you're going to play, like, they're in salary cap hell for the upcoming season because something's going to have to give to fit everybody right now.
Right.
But after this season, they really aren't in as bad cap shape as people want to make it out to be, because it just depends on where you're going to stick with. I mean, you've got a few between the guys that are coming off of the books that are probably not factoring in, and then to me anyway, I mean, I'm looking at the forwards first at least, but there's 3 forwards on the whole docket that are RFAs, and they're all, presumably they're all fits for this, and they're all, I don't think they're all going to break the bank based on what we've seen. They're not going to be $10 million players like you're talking about with Travis Konechny and what the negotiations look like with him. You're looking at Noah Cates, Morgan Frost, and Tyson Forrest. Like, Noah Cates to go from 2.625 to something kind of anywhere greater than maybe 4.5 to 5 for what his role has been, and being more on the defensive side, I would be very surprised if that's where they went with that. And Morgan Frost might have to have a tremendous season that goes above and beyond to go from 2.1 into the territory of a top 6 player, that he may very well be played as, next season. He might be that, if they don't find somebody who supplants him at the top or close to the top, he might still be your second line guy.
Yeah, that is the guy I figure he's a cog in the wheel, Noah Cates, but if they did get a young center, I mean, he could be somebody as part of a deal. He earned that money with how impressive he was the prior season, but
right.
The talk was that he was kind of lost trying to expand his offensive role, and his whole game kind of went to crap until like really the last couple games.
Yeah,
he was actually very effective.
Yeah, he got way better down the stretch. I mean, I thought he was starting to play better late February, early March too. They were having a good stretch going into that point. It was right up until the deadline hit. He looked like one of the better players on the team again. And then once everything went downhill, everybody looked bad. And then he did pick it up the last couple of games of the season again too, kind of being back into that mode of playing more defensively than focusing so much on the offensive side. And he lost a good chunk of time to injury this past year too, which didn't help matters either. So, those two are going to be fascinating after next season, or this offseason for that matter, because who knows, like there's not many guys out there that I would look at and say, oh yeah, we know that they're not going anywhere. Tippett and Forster feel like maybe a couple of the only forwards I can really think of that they probably have no interest in moving. Honestly, beyond that, maybe even Ryan Poehling at this point, because Poehling just got the extension too, and they probably are sitting there going, for what they just gave him 2 years, probably not interested in moving him over the course of that, but certainly these other guys. And that's where you, again, like it really all centers back around the Konechny conversation again, because that's where you find out, well, is that a guy that they value to that level and lump into your Tippett's and Forsters and that kind of thing, where they might be untouchable because of what they've given to this stage of everything and I guess level of commitment, because Forster's so young, you haven't even had a chance to get off the entry level contract. So of course there's like a commitment there to an extent. You just gave the commitment to Tippett, and now you're asking yourself the same question about Konechny. So
yeah.
It's about how much they see them fitting into the big picture. And there's, you got for all the, like, to me, for all the signs that we've sometimes pointed at with Frost or Cates and kind of the, I guess, to go back to the way that John Tortorella sometimes talked about them at different points, to compare it to the way that you hear about Konechny, for example, like there does seem to be, and the fact that Konechny's a part of the leadership group now probably plays a factor into his value level and where they see him versus some of these other guys. And that's what it's going to come down to, is what order do you have these guys in?
I think one of Farabee, Lawton, or Konechny, and I think it's probably going to be Lawton or Farabee will not be here. I think one of those guys is going to get moved.
Yeah.
And I think they're going to keep Konechny. I really do.
I do too.
Yeah. And it's going to be like, it's going to be a contract that's going to be, I think, in the low nines.
That's, I think between 9 and 925 is like the sweet spot there, because it'll be just north of what Timo Meier got. It's a great comparison. Full marks to Kevin Kurz for putting that out there, because
it accounts for the cap increase too, as like a percentage.
Exactly. And I think that when you look at the percentage of that contract, it makes there's an element from that perspective where it makes total sense for the player you're comparing to. Like there's just so many comparables between the two that it makes a lot of sense if you go that direction. And I just think that, it's interesting because, like, to me, if you're asking, like, I'm right there with you. It feels like one of those three is probably gone. And it feels like of the three, Farabee might be closer than the other two just because of the leadership factor. Like right off the top of my head, just looking at it, because of how hardened they've been. It comes down to having that tough conversation though, too. I've acknowledged, one of the things I've kind of acknowledged over the course of this, especially as the deadline kind of came up this past year too, is at some point you're going to have a hard conversation about Lawton. You've got to have a hard conversation, and it has nothing to do with the quality of person he is, or the intensity that he brings to the game, or whatever you want to look at. It's and his leadership and all of that. It's just a matter of, he's 29. He's on the final 2 years of a very movable contract with a $3 million cap hit, and there's interest. And at what point in time does somebody floor you with an offer that you just simply cannot refuse? And if it happens this offseason, I'd be inclined to take it. As much as I don't want to lose the guy in the room, I'd be inclined to take it for the direction you're trying to go. And to be honest, I think part of that conversation has to be, how badly do you want to keep Konechny? Because if you really badly want to keep Konechny and there's got to be a casualty involved, that might be the casualty.
Yeah, especially with Ryan Poehling filling a lot of those, checking off a lot of those boxes, I should say.
And I like I like the age range that Poehling's in too for that too. Like, everything about what they did for him with that contract made a lot of sense to me, because of the fact that he had bet on himself. He had a good, impressive year, and you're not asking for anything more than, here's 2 more years to show you're still that player, and maybe do have a bigger fit in the future picture than just a couple of years. There's nothing wrong with what they did on that front in terms of rewarding him for what he gave you last season, which was very productive. And and that's why I'm like holding off on like beyond the 2 years, because there's no guarantees he reaches double digits in goals again and is the shorthanded specialist that he was and things like that. He's going to have to go out and play. He's going to have to go out and prove that that's who he is and that that's where his career is taking shape. And if it does, then you do have a really valuable piece to the puzzle in terms of a guy who very clear cut fits on your bottom six, a guy who can play penalty kill. Let's put it this way. He's the type of guy that, especially to go back to the Michkov conversation, if Mishkov's part of the picture, I'm not worried about Matvei Michkov killing penalties. Let somebody like Ryan Poehling kill the penalties and maybe be an effective defensive forward who can chip in with some offense every so often and shift the attention for Michkov over to top 6 minutes at 5-on-5 and power play time and see if that improves. Because at one point in time, they were so the struggles were so deep on the power play that Poehling was part of that too.
That's just a clear indication that it's not working out.
Right. So if you can separate the roles, then you might have a little more something that you can stand by there. And, I had said it before in terms of when you finished where they finished, 3 years running as the worst power play in the league. You at that point, Matvei Michkov has got a free ticket to the first power play unit to see if he brings anything different to it, because you might
give him till February, right?
Yeah, you might as well. Yeah, and you might as well try, because what's the worst that could happen? You can't go any further south than it's been, so you might as well give the prospect that has been touted to have generational offensive ability and see if he improves your power play any.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Just my opinion here is just if I had the opportunity to get a rock solid second line center and Travis Konechny was the cost, I think I would do it. I understand all the countervailing arguments, but it's such a need and they're so difficult to get. Mm-hmm. I know we got a draft coming up, but these kids take like 2-3 years to really, most of them, to really start delivering. Even if they had what was it, Caden Lindstrom, Berkeley Catton, who might end up being more of a winger. I mean, we were talking about it last show with Steve Cornianos, but it's really tough to find those guys. And it used to be organizational strength. I'd say 80% of the time from 1973 until 2011, the Flyers were more strong than not at center. And they traded Carter and Richards and they didn't,
Yeah, like that era of like 06 to 09 was just a stupid abundance of centermen between the Carter, Richards. When Giroux was coming, Giroux was almost a winger then, to be honest, because they didn't have a place for him.
Right.
And then you just seamlessly bridged the gap when Couturier came into the picture a little bit. Danny Briere was always kind of back and forth between being able to be a center and a winger too. It was like you really had an abundance there when it was those guys. And the immediate of that era before, I guess the first year of, I guess it wasn't the first year actually, because they were pretty good with that first year of Richards and Carter. Actually, they made the playoffs that year. But they had RJ Umberger was part of that picture too, and Umberger played center for a little while. Like, you had a whole bunch of them. You just had so many different guys that fit the mold. And yeah, now with the abundance of wingers, I'm kind of with you on the Konechny thing. Like, look, if you can get that bona fide player, you definitely entertain the offer. What I think that comes down to is how soon you have an answer on Michkov, because if you know Mishkov's not coming, I think you're more inclined to potentially go after keeping Konechny because of what it represents for your winger position at that point. Right. Then if you know that now you have him kind of taking the place there, you already have Tippett locked up. You'd be able to keep Farabee at that point if you wanted to latch onto that, or if Farabee's just not getting you what you expect on the market. And then you got Forster coming up, and you still have, again, like it's this group of prospects that you could dip into where you're sitting here going, are guys really going to be cut out to be centers, or are we going to see shift to wingers for any of those other guys too? I won that Denver Barkey's one of the first names that comes to my mind in terms of, he's playing center for the most part, but is he going to have, is it going to translate over once he's pro, and is he going to be a better winger?
If he's an NHLer, frankly, I'd be thrilled.
Oh, sure. And that's why, look, can get excited about what you're seeing in the here and now, and I'm not downplaying it, but let the progression happen. To me, the big and the reason why I'm not holding out hope for Barkey kind of in that sense, but the reason why I want to see that work is because that to me is the biggest emphasis on the development process and getting
Right.
somebody in here. The guy that you take offhand that nobody's ever really heard of, third round, that now has become what he's become this past year for his draft plus 1 year, that has been so great in London on that all-star team that they have, that, will to be determined, but I wouldn't be shocked if they just won the whole thing at this point. I was the least surprised person when they won the OHL championship, let alone making a run at a Memorial Cup here. But yeah, so you have to hit on a few of those guys at some point. And that's why I'm kind of hopeful that they do, because that's what he's been able to do from 1 year to the next, from being drafted to his draft plus 1 year, to generate some buzz, is exactly what you want to see from a prospect. And what I hope for him is that the buzz continues. It very much, like right now, he's very much following a Morgan Frost path, where the junior play is so off the charts that you're getting really excited about what it could translate to. And I just hope that once he gets to pros, that there's an emphasis on making sure that he's prepared for what comes next and gets to a stage where you feel like you can't avoid having him at the NHL level. And he becomes a player who you look back on down the road and say, listen, that was a guy that maybe it was a big swing. Maybe it wasn't the most likely pick. Maybe it wasn't the best available player at the time, but it turned into the right player because he made something of himself, and you got to find as a third round pick. It's why I emphasize, and this is way more on a grand scale of things, but kind of the draft picture. I emphasize, a lot was made about whether or not they would trade some of the picks, right? Like the first round picks that are in the upcoming draft. And the one thing I wouldn't do is package the two to move up. That's the one thing I wouldn't do. I would still take 2 shots in the draft, but I would entertain what you could do to move up at either position if there was something out there. Now, I don't think that the gap between maybe beyond 1 and 2 and then to where they're picking at 12 smack in the middle, like that, the conversation is constantly that 2 to 15 is kind of interchangeable.
Yeah. That
So
seems
I
to be a
don't
consensus.
so I don't know that I would sit there and go crazy if they don't try to trade up from 12, because their board could be different than Buffalo's and Ottawa's and all these other teams that are in that group that are picking in the same range, and moving up 2 spots by packaging that 12th with another pick may not make much sense in the long run if you just get your guy at 12. Wherever the other pick turns out to be, obviously still to be determined. It'll be somewhere between 29th and 32nd. Same deal. If there's a reason to package it to move up a handful of spots, maybe get back into what if it's 30 and it gets you back into the low 20s at say 27. If there's somebody you really want that's on your board that you think isn't making it there, by all means explore it. But I would take 2 shots, because I think that the more shots you have at getting somebody who could click, the better.
Yeah. Oh, no doubt about it. I just got a chance to glance at the draft order. Buffalo's actually at number 11, right before the Flyers. So I'm thinking, well, the Flyers could give them, let me see, Scott Lawton and their second round pick, the higher one, if they have 2, and they get Buffalo's number 11.
It's interesting. The challenge they're going to have with that second pick that they are supposed to have anyway is that I think that's the pick, that the Columbus pick, that Columbus has has after the first round to decide whether they want to use it or defer it to 25.
You mean the second round pick?
Yes.
Okay.
That if they were to move that one, like they really don't hold any negotiating power over that pick until they know they have it, which at that point is going to be null and void anyway. So like next year, that would have been the perfect scenario, that if Columbus was picking, what would that turn into? 35th, 36th overall with that pick, to end up with, that exact idea you're bringing up. Hey, what if we gave you a good, a player who you would have traded a first for, say the 11th overall pick, for Scott Lawton, and we'll throw in 36 as well if that's what it takes, right? Like it would be a great trade chip if you were trying to get another first round pick out of the deal. But
And that's also another way to become cap compliant without having to do a buyout too.
yeah, absolutely, to do it that way. And well, that's also why I think the draft is going to be that fascinating time. And it's why I'd want to know, like, I'd be sitting there wanting to know whatever I could know on Michkov by, like, I know that they say by the end of June. That's pushing it for the draft territory. The end of the Stanley Cup final, the latest it could go is June 24th. Even that's still pushing it. I'd love to know by June 15th and just be able to have like 2 weeks till the draft to be like, okay, do we have to pivot on something here? And if we do, where do we go?
No, that's reasonable. In fact, I remember the very first comments by Medvedev from the KHL talking about there should be some kind of resolution by the end of June or something like that.
Right.
And they know what the dates are. They know when the draft is and the
Right.
playoffs. And it's just probably going to come down to that, like that nitty gritty, the period of time where
and another reason that you know they know is because one of the top prospects in the draft is part of their league.
Oh, Demito,
So,
yeah.
Right. So and to me, that's the guy who, I'm not huge on mock drafts or anything like that, but I would, after Celebrini, I think he's who's going second.
Yeah, it's him or Silyev.
Right. And I think it's going to be him. Like, I think it's going to be Demidov, and so you're not going to tell me exactly. You're not going to tell me they don't know when literally it's a top 3 prospect in the draft is part of that whole picture too.
Right.
There's just no way. So, and there's a little bit of an element to me too that wonders, with all of these, I suppose all these Easter eggs that are floating around about what's Matvei Michkov wearing today, kind of, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
that he doesn't have a bit of an inkling in his head where things are at either. Like, as much as I'm sure his agent is the one handling a lot of the discussions, I'm sure he's well informed. And I'm sure that there's, like I said, I'm sure there's more that the Flyers know that we don't, and they just can't say, because the last thing you want to do is disrupt any of this if it's a possibility. You just don't want to step on any toes and take away the possibility, because it would obviously, like, that's the one thing that, beyond everything else that we've talked about, the logjam of wingers and the need for a center and who do they trade and if they buy out this person or whatever, beyond all of that, one of the things that would really make this offseason kind of rewarding, regardless of what you had to do, is if you knew that somehow or other you kind of took the swing that you did in one draft and within a year waited it out, kept a nice open line of communication with the Russian side of it, worked out what you had to with Fedotov, and then, at the end of the tunnel also, here comes your top prospect ready to play for you. After going through what you did with Fedotov and the Cutter Gauthier trade and all of that stuff, it would be a nice reward for the fans to have something to get excited about like that. Even if it's not a finished, even if the puzzle's not finished yet, I think it would be a nice reward to be excited about the prospect of him being here and being able to, at least from my perspective anyway, because I have a great view of a lot of the people who sit down below, to imagine the number of, I can only assume, number 39 Michkov jerseys that would show up if he did come over and play, because I can't imagine that there wouldn't be a ton of them waiting. And if we thought that the ovation that Fedotov got just for being out on the ice after kind of dealing with everything he went through was big, they announced him in a starting lineup at the beginning of the season, and I can only imagine what the building is going to sound like.
It'll be probably the biggest thing since '88, really.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, the only guy that really even approaches that really is Forsberg, and we got him toward the end. Even then, he dazzled. Well, I love that player.
I know that was
against Buffalo. I keep thinking. I always remember him skating around the zone, setting up the goal. It was
a little bit. So that's a little bit before my time of covering the team, but I was at that game, and it was fascinating to watch. That was Eric Desjardins' last goal in the league before he ended up retiring. That was his last goal. So
underappreciated.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, he was a good one. I mean, with him and there were a lot of Flyers that they didn't have any homegrown guys. I mean, once they got Bob Daly, they got a peek at a guy who could really move the puck, and he had some size. They always criticized him in that era for not being more physical. But then when he went down, see, I remember he breaks his ankle in Buffalo. Now you're jogging my memory here. That's why they had to go out and get Mark Howe. And once they had Mark Howe, well, we never saw anything like that. I guess
Yeah.
that was he retired before. Wait a minute. Let me see. Did you ever recall seeing Mark Howe play?
No, I don't. It was probably seeing him play was probably a little bit before my time. He was still playing at the time, I believe. I'm actually looking that up right now. It's really funny you're bringing. Why the hell not? I'll shoot this out as a little plug for a second. So tomorrow night, through family, through family, one of my wife's uncles. So my uncle through family, through marriage, owns a New Balance store in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, and they are having a grand reopening. And there is a bunch of Flyer alumni who are going to be in attendance because he works very closely with the Flyers Alumni Association and knows a lot of Flyers alums. He's great friends with Bob Kelly, so Bob the Hound Kelly will be there. Lou Nolan will be there. Joe Watson's going to be there signing his book. Mark Howe is supposed to be there. Bill Barber is supposed to be there. And then to really dig one out of a page from more of my book, Frank the Animal Bialois is going to be there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
He's a character, that guy. Fantastic.
Dude still looks like he could beat the crap out of anybody. So
hey, I'm not challenging him.
Yeah, but Mark Howe was probably the end of his career was right up at like the tail end. I believe he went back in. He was off the Flyers in the year I was born. So 92 season was when he left the Flyers after that season.
And when he hang around for another 3 years, was it?
He signed with Detroit after that, and then hung around for a few more years, I think through 95.
Okay.
But I would have been way too young to for what it's in 94, 95, he only played 18 games. So yeah, I would not have really remembered much about Mark Howe playing. The earliest, believe it or not, one of the earliest memories I have of Mark Howe is, so my dad used to have, there was this, the whole Howe family, so Gordy, Mark, and Marty made a series of videos. It was like hockey skills. Here's Howe videos, and my dad had one of them, and I used to just watch it religiously. And it's pretty, it's funny enough how like my path and Mark Howe's path have certainly crossed multiple times. From, obviously he was always in the box when he was scouting, so
sure.
He was local to the area, and I've seen him a couple times outside of it since too. So like, yeah, it's definitely, he's the best. He's the best in both ways. He's a great person and obviously an outstanding hockey player, Hall of Famer for a reason, right?
Yeah, it was a pretty good winger, but it's just a spectacularly good defenseman who came along in an era where he just wasn't going to get the recognition. But anyway, yeah, you grew up in an era with Bork and Paul Coffey and Dennis Potvin. It's tough. But anyway, so getting back to the Flyers and kind of getting close to wrapping things up here. They talked about Eric Johnson maybe still being in the plans. I mean, he was a nice guy and he had a good time here and all that. I just don't. We talked about the volume of D-men that they have. Right. I just don't see it. Yeah,
I definitely don't see it with him. There isn't, depending on who's here and who's not truly, I guess, like as this plays out, because there's so much, like, to me, there's so much that's subject to change. Like, I think back to last year or last off season when the Flyers had done a pretty decent amount of work already before free agency had ever hit. So there was actually some spots to fill a little bit, because by that point they had done the Provorov trade. They had done the Hayes trade. There were some vacancies that were opened up, and then you were left kind of filling the gap between, listen, it can be a younger player can fill that spot, or we need backup. So there was at least reason to go get somebody. I've toyed with the idea, and maybe they do this at forward too. Maybe this is where that actually comes into play, but I think they're going to try to find somebody in free agency that can be a little bit like Sean Walker. That's a little bit more of that, hey, listen, it's not a big long-term thing. It's a 1-year thing, and see if there's a way that they couldn't flip that later, because Sean Walker became invaluable to this process for what he was able to get them in return.
Sure. Yeah.
And I can see Danny Briere being the type who's going to who would at least try to catch lightning in a bottle twice and see if there's not a guy that under the right circumstances, playing in the right role, could be worth something at the deadline that you get a little something back in return. I could see that being the case.
Yeah.
Because there's just not a lot of, especially if they have to go the buyout route with Atkinson, and if they move one of these other forwards we've talked about in the offseason. I guess unless it's not Scott Lawton that they move in the offseason and his name comes up as it does every year at the trade deadline, there's really not any other name that jumps out to me that I sit there and go, oh yeah, you're in, like, unless you're going to do that with Garnet Hathaway. That's really the only other player I can see that you would like sit there and be like, he's in the last year of a deal and maybe you flip him at the deadline, but there's not many. Certainly not one on defense unless they bring in exactly that type of guy.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. You know, the salary has to be right. I mean, they got they're going to take a flyer on Oscar Eklund from
That too, yeah.
Sweden. He's a has a modicum of skill in a left winger. He played in the Swedish Hockey League. He might end up being more like a tweener. He can, he doesn't look out of place in the NHL. I just don't know what. You don't know what you have.
And until I see him, the first name that pops into my head whenever I see anything like this is Linus Sandin, who they did the same thing with, and it ultimately didn't work out. But yeah, I mean, he played a couple NHL games, but it ultimately didn't work out. So that's a wait and see thing. Also, you take a flyer, you see if there's anything that works out with this, and if it does, great. If it doesn't, it's like a free agent signing. They took a shot and you didn't give up assets for it. So there's no guarantees he even ends up on your payroll, your cap roll at the end of this thing. So like, don't worry about that.
He could go through training camp and head back to Sweden. You never know.
Exactly.
Right?
So like right now, there's no sense worrying about something that isn't a certainty with the cap.
No, absolutely. So, Kevin, I don't know if we really came up with a plan for the Flyers, but
we came up with a lot of questions to answer is what we came up with.
Yeah, I think so. I think we've explored a lot of territory, and I think the fulcrum on this thing really revolves around Michkov. I think we can probably agree on that.
Yeah, the idea of planning for this thing is that there's the plan probably should be the same rebuilding plan, and what can you move to get assets back and kind of things like that, and can you work out one of those creative trades that we talked about, maybe with one of these other things that fill maybe one of your center positions or something like that. And that should be the plan as long as you don't know about Michkov. But I think that right now, because of all of the things that are out there, the Michkov thing could turn that on a dime and kind of change the course of this just a little bit, because he's going to be here. And until we know that for certain, that's when you're stuck. But that's why it's hard to put together a complete plan, because there's the rebuilding plan that they kind of want to keep following and that they should keep following. And then the contingency plan of, if Michkov comes over, then what? So that's the challenge of putting together a plan, is that there's really kind of two plans in effect, and it's just a matter of which one they have to execute on more.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So with that, why don't you tell the folks where they can catch you on social media and your podcast, you would think?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Kevin_Durso on all of the platforms, Instagram, X, formerly known as Twitter, all that type of stuff. YWT Podcast, the You Would Think podcast. We're kind of into our summer schedule, so we're not doing weekly episodes anymore. Well, at least for right now, we'll probably do a little bit of something with regularity closer to all the activity. So, so Stanley Cup awarded and draft, free agency, and then when everything slows back down, we'll go back to kind of the bi-weekly thing. But you can find that at YWT Podcast, or just search YWT Podcast. It's on all of the podcast platforms, also on YouTube. And so you can watch it too. You can see us if you so choose. And obviously also, from the writing side of things and radio and things like that, 97.3 ESPN.com and sportstalkphilly.com and all of that. So that's pretty much everything that I got for you right now.
Yeah, fantastic. Just a reminder to people that you can catch the O&B Puckcast on the app formerly known as Twitter, at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck. Of course, you can also catch us on our backup plan getter at O&B Puckcast, at O&B Puckcast. And you can catch us on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, TuneIn, Amazon Audible, Deezer. We have a YouTube page. Just plug in there, O&B Puckcast. And of course, we have a Facebook page as well. If you could rate and subscribe, particularly on Apple Podcasts, it really helps move us up the charts when people are looking for a Philadelphia Flyer podcast. And of course, that's what the O&B Puckcast is. And we want to say thank you for joining us tonight. Until next time, everybody, take care.